So we're going to move to a panel I'm very excited about. I've been interested in collective intelligence for a long time now. One of the most intriguing mechanisms regarding collective intelligence are what people call prediction markets. It's the use of some market mechanisms designed in order to pull information from the community and use that to make predictions. I've been following this since there was some very old prediction market system called Inkling prediction markets. I don't know if that exists anymore, but that was pre-crypto thing. So this type of technologies has been used to predict like product launches, like Oscar winners, as Clément mentioned, presidential election. Prediction markets are also a cornerstone to a also very intriguing and fascinating governance system called Futarchy. So I'm very, very happy to have here a bunch of experts to discuss prediction markets, and in particular one specific part of prediction markets, which is the oracle problem. So when you do a prediction market, then at some point you need to pay the people who made the bets on different outcomes, and then how do you know the information that you're going to use to make the payouts is going to be real and or not? This is like a fundamental issue to solve in order to have a prediction market that work. And if you have prediction markets that work, we can have all of these collective intelligence applications connected to them. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I guess this might be one of the, so this panel might have like most knowledgeable experts in the world probably about oracles and prediction markets. And so I'm very, very happy to be here. So Edmund, Edgar graduated from Oxford University in 1997 and then moved to Japan, where he lives in a pottery town called Mashiko. If I knew that before, I would have visited you during the DevCon in Osaka. No. I had no idea you live in Japan.
Oh yeah.
Which part of Japan is that?
Okay, it's about 100 kilometers north of Tokyo, a little bit out into the countryside.
Well, if I ever go to Japan again, or if we are ever allowed to travel again, I'm definitely going to visit you. So Edmund built the world's first smart contract oracle, Reality Keys, in 2013. You know, that's a really, really early stage. He built the Ethereum-based system for various Japanese clients, including a proof of concept for the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And his current project, Reality.eth, is a crowdsourced smart contract oracle and fact-checking system. So welcome, Edmund.
Thanks, great to be here.
Our next panelist, as you know, is Clément Lesaege, who has an engineering degree of the University of Technology of Compiègne and a Master of Science in Computer Science from Georgia Tech. And he's, as you know, co-founder and CTO at Kleros. Welcome, Clément, again.
Hi again. Well, I never really left.
And Alex Herrmann, our third panelist, holds a master in mathematics. He worked 3 years as a trainee at Continental working on AI, and 3 years at Gnosis, where he focuses on oracles, Futarchy, and DEX development. Welcome, Alex. Glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you. Really exciting.
Well, let me start with some basic questions for part of the audience who are maybe not that much familiar with oracles. So what is an oracle, and why should we care about them? Anyone can answer. This is decentralized. Just.
I think oracles are really very fundamental building blocks for blockchains and kind of also this vision of a decentralized computer. Because as it was already alluded in a previous talk, definitely there are these objective functions that are kind of based on mass that just execute code. These are basically the smart contracts within the blockchain, and they can operate very, very well and execute many things autonomously. But when it comes to that they should react on situations that are happening outside of the blockchain, then definitely there needs to be this bridge that brings information to these smart contracts, to this brand new world of blockchains. And that's the thing, the piece where oracles come into play.
Yeah, that's a way to incorporate outside world and sometimes slightly subjective information into your application. Because your smart contract, they can read other smart contract, They can know how humans interact with them, but they cannot know who won the elections. They cannot know the time, like if it's raining. They cannot know if it's raining. They cannot know earthquake. There is a lot of stuff that smart contract cannot know by themselves. And if we want to be make something a bit better, then just self-referencing application that we often see in DeFi. If you want to connect that with the outside world, you need to bring this information on the chain, and that's what Oracle are for.
Expand a bit on these practical cases why we want oracles. You mentioned briefly whether I think presidential election. In which situations do we care a lot about oracles for practical purposes?
So we spoke about prediction markets because that's what is currently connected to Kleros oracles. You want to know information about the outside world so that people can make prediction of those, basically bet on those. And this gives odds of event happening. So if you're in the US and if you consider moving to the US, for example, and you may think it may be a more or less welcoming environment, depending on who wins the election, then you go on Omen and you see there is this percent chance of this candidate winning. Does that give you some information? People can use it just for fun, sometimes like the same way they would use betting, but I think it may be a transition period, and the real power of prediction market are to be unlocked when you have people which are ready to lose a bit of money to get information. So for example, if I'm an insurance company, I want to know what are the risks of car crash in this new market I'm not already in. I can create prediction market about this amount of car crash. I can put liquidity, even if I'm going to lose some of the liquidity, and some people are going to trade on it. And the idea is that I'm going to lose money on average, but that's fine because the information I will earn is going to be more important than the money I lose. And people who usually were betting at a negative sum game, so on average, they lose money, they will be able to be basically betting on positive sum game. So instead of just being positive only because of the thrill of the bet, only the joy of playing the game, they can actually be also positive from a financial perspective. So this is one of those big prediction markets. And you have also all the insurance. You want to make some insurance for earthquake, for example. You need to know when there is an earthquake so you can pay out those insurance. You can do that also for farming. You can make water insurance. You can make insurance against financial crisis. You can make a lot of insurance. You can even make some insurance about pandemic. Actually, that exists in the classic financial system. That's pandemic bonds. So now you can also make pandemic bonds on chain. And if there is a pandemic, the pandemic bonds are going to be automatically paying. So that's really important to making a financial product, I would say. And I include insurance as financial product. I'm not just speaking about financial derivative and stuff for trader. I'm also speaking about daily life financial product like insurance and impacting your daily life. Like for example, being paid huge insurance amount if you have a pandemic, such that you can have a really fast government response because they get the funding.
Good. So it's for people who are just getting into this. So this is a very important piece of infrastructure that is going to define the workings of the future financial system, if you want. So what are the different, I'm going to ask this to Edmund, so because he has been so silent up to now, what are the different ways to approach the Oracle problem and with potential advantages and drawbacks?
So when we started doing reality keys originally, I think a lot of us saw the problem originally as kind of how is the information that we want is on a website somewhere, right? The information that we want for the blockchain is kind of known, but the problem is how do we bridge a website somewhere to the blockchain? That was kind of originally what a lot of people were thinking the problem kind of consisted of. And at that time, so some of the first sort of oracles that we saw were kind of dealing with that kind of problem. But for applications like prediction markets, the information that you want isn't necessarily in some trusted source. And if it isn't in some trusted source, then as we've seen a little bit with Reuters, ideally we can actually make that trusted source sign some data and send it to the blockchain, or just so we don't actually need some piece in the middle. So our original product, Reality Keys, was this kind of piece in the middle, trying to get information that was known on some website or by some trusted source onto, as it was at the time, the Bitcoin blockchain. But what we saw was that a lot of the most interesting applications are actually creating information, right? They're discovering things that that there isn't some known source for, that we actually want to to discover. We want a process to actually create that information and get it on the blockchain. And it turns out that the blockchain is also a great platform for managing a social system to create that information. So then what does that system look like? Fundamentally, it's some kind of social system that gives people incentives to tell the truth. Then I guess we can talk in a little bit more detail about what kind of systems that looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see Alex nodding. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think Edmund started it very nicely in the timeline at the very beginning with his own approach. I think then one of the first other systems that appeared and was pretty popular was Augur. And they introduced a very interesting concept, basically the concept of economically safe oracles, in the sense that they are looking at the open interest. That's basically all the money that they are securing. For example, in the use case of a prediction market, it's the money that people are using for betting on certain outcomes. And then they say that their token value of the whole system should be higher, or should be in a certain relationship to this open interest. And if it fulfilled certain conditions, then they could state that their system was economically safe. And yes, that has many good advantages. And I think until now, the system is not yet broken, but it also has many disadvantages. For example, that the system needs to collect a lot of fees so that the token value of the Augur system maintains its value much higher than the open interest is.
Yeah, so just to expand a little bit on how that works, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the operations of it. The thought is basically that the blockchain can't necessarily tell you what is true, but it can ultimately tell you what is more valuable. And the blockchain can tell you what is more valuable because it can put up 2 tokens and let people buy and sell them, and then the one that gets is most popular is the more valuable one. So the insight, this was a guy called Paul Stortz came out with this, who does originally a project called Truthcoin and then now a project called DriveChain on trying to get Bitcoin to soft fork something for him. So had this idea that you can leverage the kind of a bet on the value of this system, and you can use that to get an opinion about truth. And the way that you do that is, if you absolutely need to, you have some steps before this, but if you absolutely need to, you can split your whole system in 2, right? You can fork your system, and then you've got 2 versions of the system. One version is committed to one fact and the other is committed to another fact, right? So if we were trying to settle the bet about whether Trump won the election, we can fork the system into one version that says that Trump won the election and the other system that says that Biden won the election. And then we can then compare which of those systems is more valuable. And we would hope that since Biden won the election, the one that says Biden won the election is going to be more valuable. And that question of which system is more valuable will be a reasonable proxy for which thing is true. And if you believe that, then provided there isn't enough money settling in these markets to make it worth actually rigging the market about which of these versions is true, because you could, if you're prepared to pay more than the system is worth for the nonsense market, then you can actually rig this thing, right? If you want to say this garbage version of Augur is worth more than the other version, and I'm just going to buy up all the tokens I need to make the market show that price, then you can make it look like Trump won, even though Biden won. So you have this kind of economic security bound in Augur where if the value of the system is greater plus a security margin than the amount of money staked in bets, then they think it's secure, and if not, then they don't. And so this has a number of kind of interesting problems maybe we can talk about.
I have a question. Yeah, go ahead, Clément.
I think it's nice to have property, but maybe too strict and sometimes unrealistic. Unrealistic because you can have what we call the parasitic markets. So you could look at the result of the oracle, but doing all the stuff with it and not paying any fee, which goes to increase the token value. So you could say, okay, there is this percentage of parasitic market, but then you may end up, in this case, increasing the fee even more, making even more people go to parasitic market because the main market are more expensive. So you have this kind of problem, which can happen if you want to be sure of some economic security. You have the problem that sometimes answer it's hard to evaluate what are at stake for those answers. Like if you look at Kleros, if you look at prediction market or escrow, you could evaluate that pretty easily. Now, if you are looking at created registry, for example, or would you evaluate the value of having a specific item registered or not? That's starting to be a bit more trickier. And in practice, like large systems, they may not fulfill those requirements. For example, Ethereum does not really pretend to have a ETH value to exceed the value of all the other assets which can rely on it, because you only need it to be so expensive to buy 15%. That is not possible, or so costly because then you break the system, it gets forked and your token are valueless. That the value you could extract practically from breaking a system will not be worth what you would have paid. When you see those economic securities, they also generally assume that the price of the token will stay constant if someone try to buy most of the token, like 15% of the token, while in practice the price would increase. So in some way you may understate it via parasitic market. In some other way, you may overstate it because you have extra security, because if you try to get 15%, you increase the price. So I think it's something nice to ask, but defining it at the system level, even if it has some interest, may actually restrict a bit more the utilization that you can do of your system. But that's fine. Like people may have different kind of views they want. They're fine with different level of subjectivity. You can have different systems.
Yeah, and I'd add that this attempt to kind of manage the security bound, right? They have this attempt in Augur where they try to make sure that there isn't too much money staked. And what they do is that if it looks like there is going to be too much money staked compared to the value of their token, they increase their fees. But that hits you smack into the problem that Clément mentioned with parasitic markets, where if you make a market that doesn't actually pay the fee payers, but that just uses the information that it extracts from the market, then as you raise the fees, the parasitic market actually becomes more valuable. And you can imagine a dynamic where the parasitic market becomes more valuable. Users actually start to drain away from the Augur markets and into the parasitic markets, and that reduces the value of the Augur token. As you reduce the value of the Augur token, you then need to compensate by raising the fees some more, right? Because the value of Augur's gone down, so the value of the bet still staked has gone up. So then you need to do it again, and you end up in this kind of death spiral where you're gradually draining all of the users into the parasitic market. And in the process, you're killing the thing for the Augur users, and you're also killing the thing for the parasitic market. But there's a kind of a tragedy of the commons where it's worth everybody's while to use the parasitic market. There's no situation where a rational purely self-interested user is going to use the pay the fees and use Augur over using the parasitical market, even though doing that will actually destroy the system. So when I tried to before we did the integration with Kleros for Reality.eth, I did an integration with Augur, which would use Augur as kind of the settlement mechanism, and the developers got really mad at me for doing that. But getting mad at somebody isn't really a security mechanism. But I just like another problem with this mechanism, just in a way an even more fundamental problem with the mechanism, and I don't really have a good solution, is that we're basing it on this idea that the value of the prediction market is a decent proxy for the truth. But as a pure matter of business development, that's not necessarily true, right? So let's imagine right now we have this insane market, just the maddest prediction market I've ever seen in 15 years of observing prediction markets, where you can bet on an election that's already happened and been settled, basically been settled. The votes have been cast. We know the result, and you can bet on this market, and you can get like 15 cents to the dollar that the loser is going to win, right? And so now it turns out there's this whole kind of echo chamber of people who are telling themselves that the loser of the election has won the election. So then what happens when you try to resolve that? Well, it's not entirely inconceivable that if you had two prediction markets, one is a normal zero-sum game for rational people, right? And the other one is a kind of a right-wing facts-oriented confirmation bias confirming prediction market for Trump-supporting maniacs with a lot of cryptocurrency. It might be that second one is actually a better business proposition than the sensible prediction market. And if that's true, then you can fork the system. You can say Trump won. All the people who believe Trump won, or who think that there's a market for believing that Trump won, will buy that version, and it'll settle, wrongly compared to any objective facts. And then you'll have this crazy fork of Augur whose job is just like to settle markets based on the biases of crazy people.
I think now it's becoming really interesting. I also, of course, have my take on that. So I think overall, if it really happens that if you're calling them the crazy people, if they're all in bear markets and there are arbitrators or oracles that kind of settle then to kind of their favor because they are their main clients, then I think automatically this will kind of split the system. It will kind of spread the word, and people would know, okay, on these prediction market platform, especially with these arbitrators and oracles, you can kind of expect this and this result because people have this perception of their world, and then they will interpret it in that way. But I think that's perfectly fine if something like that really exists and if it really has value, because then there will emerge other prediction market platforms that actually are kind of connected to, I would say, better arbitrators. I don't know, but yeah, at least then there will be basically these prediction markets for the people who perceive the world differently. And that's perfectly fine. I think in the end, it would then basically happen that most of the customers would again converge to one prediction market platform, but I think it's fine.
Well, they might all just say, what is this nonsense, right? I mean, they might say, look, TruthCoin, so the TruthCoin design, Paul's design, the Augur design didn't work. Any rational punter is going to say, I'm not going to do that. But it's all going to be shared in all the the alternate reality social media channels are all going to be sharing this thing and saying, look at this amazing kind of prediction market. It gives us the truth, even the rest of the world is all wrong. So the rest of the world is going to go back to using Betfair and just regular normal prediction markets. And the lunatic version is the only version that survives. I mean, that's not inconceivable to me, I guess somebody wants to use somebody would stick to maybe the kind of the rational punter, but just not the first time it had to decide kind of design. But I don't know.
This may actually happen.
Yeah.
Because if you have this like 19% for Trump, you may actually have a decent community. I think he's going to go to arbitration. I think it's probably going to be resolved as Biden unless something else happens in between. And you may perfectly have someone deciding, okay, I'm going to make like the QAnon fork of Kleros. And in this reality, the juror who voted no, who voted no, so Biden does not win, will get their token, and everyone else will be slashed, and you get like a QAnon version of Kleros. And that's perfectly fine, because that may be better than to have huge disagreement between the community. You just basically split when like it's not going well between us, and they get their own system. So that may be like the extreme view, like from maybe Edmund interpretation of this 19%. You can interpret the 19% a bit more rationally, rationally by assuming that actors are more rational, which could due to the fact that some of the election could be cancelled, like some recount or some legal action could lead to have some state being cancelled and to have to revote, where in this case, if enough states have to revote, the result will not be known by the resolution. And in this case, that's like 50-50% split. So people may be buying a Trump token because they think that even if he may not win ultimately, he may be able to get the election to be redone in some states, or because he may just keep the power, mostly illegally, but like, I don't know, like you get a few QAnon militia which prevent the delegate to vote, and you get the vote in favor of Trump, and you end up with a coup. That's also, I don't think it's that likely, but it may account for 1 to maybe 3% in favor of Trump extra to just the result of the popular vote. So every time you have a way you can interpret that, or prediction markets are wrong, like they are giving those huge percentage to those really unlikely facts. Or you could also interpret it that prediction markets are able to incorporate more information than general method could do. So if you look at the poll, for example, the poll tend to really overstate the chance of Biden winning states. So Biden probably won, but assuming no election get cancelled, but assuming the results stand, he would have won, but he would have won of lesser margin compared to what people were predicting it was winning. So in this way, seeing the prediction market being more cautious about the Biden win may not be that crazy. And you have also a good response to people who tell you that prediction market are crazy. But if you think the prediction market are crazy and that Trump has like 1% chance of winning and it has 19, well, just buy Biden share. Like you can just put your money where your mouth is and actually make the market go in a state where you believe it's not crazy anymore. So you can say that to people who not really believe the market.
Yeah, let's go stick a little bit longer with the thought of the QAnon Kleros, right? Because I kind of love this. So because the problem here is that so if you have so if we have our fork and we've got Kleros are split into Kleros and QAnon Kleros, and let's also assume that QAnon Kleros is more popular with the market since as we know, everybody in the crypto space is often not, right? So let's assume that that's more popular in the market and QAnon Kleros is better off. That's actually okay for Kleros, right? If you're a Kleros token holder, that's fine. You've got both of them. You can sell the QAnon one if you want to and use the normal one. Kleros still functions. The problem is if you bought Biden, right? If you bought USD denominated Biden on Omen, or if you're using Augur and the same thing happens, like Augur has forked into two, and we've got we've got QAnon Augur and normal Augur, and you bet on you bet on Biden, and you were right, but since the market has so in the Augur case, it's compared the values of these two systems, and it said QAnon Kleros QAnon Augur is more valuable. In the case of Kleros, if you've got our kind of Omen Reality ETH Kleros stack, I guess what's going to happen is that, so let's say we don't have the forking built into the protocol in this stack, right? In Kleros,
no, it's not built into the protocol, but
right.
You can always make it by yourself. You can see the example of what happened with Hive. What did Hive fork? The platform, like publishing platform, it was forked to make Hive.
I don't know.
That platform.
Yeah. So you had a platform which was basically taken control, like that Justin Tron and a few ally.
Steam.
Control. Steam. Exactly, Steam.
Yeah.
So to control of Steam, and then you had a fork from the community, even if they were a minority of token holder, which led to Hive. And in this case, in both ways, they both canceled each other token via governance. So the fork, you just need to fork, but even on the main chain, they had some governance proposal of removing the token of people who were supporting and originate at the origin of the fork of Hive. So even if it's not really built into the protocol, it can always more or less be made by fork and governance decision, even if it's less smooth than if it was already built in, like hard-coded in the smart contract.
Yeah. So no matter what
happens, let me make a short call to order just for people who are in the audience. Like, can we first explain fast how we are working together with Omen, Reality, and Kleros, and then we can continue with this discussion because lots of people are getting lost. So yeah, whoever wants to start, yeah.
You want to? Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
So you want us to explain very quickly how the different systems are working together, right? So on the one hand side, we have Omen. It's a prediction market platform where people can just bet on outcomes as the election. And then the Omen platform is linking into Realitio because over there it can basically ask the first subjective questions. For example, will Trump win the election? And over there on Realitio, one can bid. There's basically an escalation mechanism where people can bid on which should be the right answer. And usually, in most cases, over there, the process is already ending because people in non-contentious cases would only vote for one outcome, and then it's basically settled. Then the Omen platform would be aware of this answer, and everything can go smoothly on. But then if it's really a continuous case, then it's kind of the escalation on Realitio goes so high that it says, okay, at that point of time, I don't want to make the final call. And then it goes into Kleros, which will do the final arbitration in that case.
Do we have a case of a real case that was arbitrated at Kleros coming from Omen in the past? Maybe I heard case 302.
Yes, definitely. And I think the most interesting was definitely this case 302. There was this prediction market, whether there are more than 1,000 deaths in the US per day in July. And it was the question that was asked on the Omen platform was very general, like, is there a report of more than 1,000 deaths? And it then actually happened that some very incredible news platforms were reporting, yes, there were more than 1,000 deaths, but others were actually not reporting it. And it had to do kind of how it was accounted over the weekend and so on. So it was in the end really a subjective interpretation. And it was not clear at that point of time how it should be interpreted. And so it was really the perfect case where one actually needs arbitrators that bring clearance into this ambiguous situation.
So here you had a lot of discussion, not really on the fact of the word, but a lot about the interpretation of the question. What does reporting mean? Does it mean, is it like the consensus report? Is it reported by at least one credible source? You had question about, well, if you have people reporting less, are there more or less credible? Because it may be easier to miss people dying than to invent people dying who are actually not dead. So if you go in the forest and you say, oh, I've seen 2 people dead, and someone else say, oh, I also saw 2 people dead, and someone say I saw 3 people dead. Well, probably the one who say he saw 3 people dead is the most likely to be correct. It's just that he saw all of them, but the other only saw 2. But then you have another counter argument which arrived, but unfortunately quite late in the dispute process. And they were looking at pattern where they were looking at weekly pattern, and report tend to be higher after the weekend. So one potential explanation of higher report would be that people will die during the weekend, but they will only be reported in the stats after the end of the weekend or of the holidays. Unfortunately, I think this point arrived way too late in the process, and at this point, the community may already have made their mind. So that's interesting because otherwise, if you had no arbitration, well, you would have a irremediable split. While here, you may have like 60-40, both in terms of juror and community member of Omen, which were in favor of answering yes. So you had a way to get this dispute solved. It's also interesting because it led to a discussion about the rule of Omen to try to have rules which are already dealing with the situation. Because every time when you have Oracle or dispute resolution system, you want to give certainty. You want people to know that if this happens, this is going to be ruled this way, even if it may not be the way you like it. At least you know it in the first place before interacting. So you want decision to be predictable, so that led to some extra rule being created. So I think that was quite an interesting case and probably productive for system improvements.
Exactly, I completely agree. We learned a lot from this case, and especially now on prediction market platforms like Omens, there are now kind of more of a framework of rules how specific questions should be interpreted, because I think it was also really a hard case for the arbitrators of Kleros, because there was not really a framework on how should the product be perceived, how should these kind of situations be dealt with. And now there is much more framework in place, so that the next time, hopefully, especially during the question with the election, they would have a better framework to answer questions or to arbitrate.
But the election question will actually be about fact and not really about interpretation, I think. So that's going to be another kind of beast.
I think the uncertainty of this question actually comes from the fact that people might think that according to some interpretation, Biden has not yet won the election, because if there is still a lawsuit against the election process, then you cannot yet officially call him the winner. And because of that, people are actually bidding against it. They think that Trump could, with all his current power, delay process, could delay these official decisions and could still have processes in process when the platform actually needs to make the decision.
So you may have a bit of the Trump percent explained by that, but I don't think it's explaining most of the Trump percent, because if you look at some other prediction market platforms, they made a market about will Trump be inaugurated, and with a resolution date after the inauguration, and they tend to have a pretty similar percentage in favor of Trump. So I think it means that people are really betting on the fact that Trump is actually going to win and be inaugurated.
I think it's a really interesting. What happens if you end in a situation, God forbid, but you have like Congress accepting like Trump as president and the Supreme Court saying that the president is Biden? Like, what would be the right answer for what the Oracle should give to that?
Yeah, that really depends on how the question is phrased, doesn't it? Because one question you could ask is who is going to wield ultimate power, right? Who are the army going to obey could be your market, or you might have a market on what does the process actually say, and so I think that really depends on the market. And but it also sounds like we're going to have this kind of developing Kleros case law, right? Where depending how previous cases we determine, people are going to say, well, in case 302, we did this, so that's our precedent going forward. There's an opportunity for people to start a new job as like a Kleros lawyer, who's going to understand all the Kleros case law and going to be able to say, well, in this situation, your contract needs to say this, or your market, your terms need to say this. In this situation, they need to say this because per the precedent in case 489, this is how it's handled.
There is already like a Kleros law firm.
Yeah.
Don't have much case. And actually, I think people at the case 302 will have had a huge interest into hiring them. Let's see that's happen for Trump too.
What were the learnings of case 302? You mentioned a bit of this, but let's dig into that. Like, what have we learned about oracles, about prediction markets, and how to frame these decisions for jurors, or how to make this work better?
Yeah, when kind of the whole case of 302 escalated, there was really not too much framework in place how certain questions should be interpreted, but the platform itself kind of already made the decision that they want to go with these very generalized questions. So in the case of the reports, it was only in the question, it was only asking were more than 1,000 deaths reported, but it was really not specified by which source and so on. And so I think this was now the first test to this philosophy. Is that actually a good approach? Other prediction market platforms, for example, Augur, I think they are going a little bit of a different way over there. Things are more specified, but this has then also other disadvantages. And so this was the very first test. And I think we learned a lot from it because we now are more aware of these weaknesses, of these generalized questions. And we think that there needs to be a little bit more background so that jurors can actually make good arbitrations. And so what the platform in the end decided is that they still want to go with these very general questions because it's much more accessible for the users who want to participate on this platform, but one still needs a little bit more of the complexity, and that's why the platform generated these frameworks how things should be interpreted. For example, now if it comes to reports, definitely these general questions are allowed, but it is a clear instruction to jurors that they should look at quantities, like how many good resources were actually reporting that. Like in this case, there was definitely only one that was reporting higher numbers, but most of them were reporting lower numbers. So with that, jurors have a better way to make an actual arbitration. And also one should really take into account the quality of these reports from the different sources. So with that, I think with these new rules, the decision would have been different from the courts.
Yeah, and what is interesting is because here you had you have an external arbitration system. For Omen, they would maybe want to have a particular interpretation, but which was not the one most of the community members would have been in favor of. So here what happened is that the interpretation which was most favored by the community was the one executed. But then you had some change of rule by the XDAO governance, which means that in the future, you can have decisions which are interpreted in another manner. And here we see emerging a separation of power that we can see in classic government between like legislative and judiciary. So in this case, Kleros would be judiciary, the XDAO would be legislative, where legislative, they change the law according to a specific set of events which happen, but it is not retroactive. So people who were in the first dispute are not impacted by the change of rule. We don't just say, okay, like you're gonna lose because that's all we want the rule to be. At first, we look at what the rule were when the dispute was created. And for the further dispute, you may have a change of law. But it is protecting the user to have this separation of power. Because if you have, for example, just the XDAO, which was only one power and deciding of both the rule and both of the interpretation and the resolution, that would be strange for them to settle in one way, but then change the rule in another way. But here with the separation of power, you can perfectly do that. And sometimes we are in crypto, we are doing a lot of new things, and we are sometimes like kind of like going counter to what is currently made. We can also sometimes get inspiration by classic governance systems and good practice such as separation of power.
Good. I would like to dig a bit into like what goes into designing good oracles, because as we said, there is a situation where like malicious actors would want to attack an oracle to report a false decision and then, well, make money in a malicious way. So what things do the good mechanism designer consider when designing oracles?
Well, I think you need to assume that everyone is gonna try to attack your system. Like you have blockchain system, which are really relying on game theory and economics more than trust, because people tend to be anonymous. So you don't have this kind of like power which can jail bad actors. So you really need to have the economic incentive in place for people to behave currently. I think I spoke a bit about that in the previous talk. So you need to be able to have systems which are Sybil resistant. You need to wonder what will happen if you have some attacker with a huge amount of resources. You have to look what happens if people they are just motivated by gains and they are not really going to be honest. So you have a lot of frameworks to kind of like look at security of the system, and you really should look at it from economic perspective, not just thinking, okay, people are going to be nice, and if you tell them to do so, they're going to do so, because in practice, that's not what happens. If you have systems which can be exploited, either the systems are too small to be worth exploiting, or they're going to be exploited once they are big enough.
Anything to add to that answer? Or?
Yeah, just one thing to add. The thing that always kind of scares me about all of the crypto economic systems, I mean, generally, everything from Bitcoin on down has worked, to me surprisingly well. And I think Kleros it's very impressive how well Kleros has worked, and also how well Augur has worked. I don't think Augur has ever settled the market wrongly, or at least not obviously wrongly. But the fundamental assumption at the base of it is that you've got a bunch of rational, self-interested actors, which is nothing like the world we actually live in, where we're surrounded by raging idiots. So, right? So, these assumptions that we made, especially when they become kind of social systems, if they're kind of very sort of dry economic systems used by experts, then that's one thing. But when we're making these systems that we're using, as we to kind of describe the world around us, and when that's bound up with kind of identity and all these kind of sort of human sort of monkey habits of thinking rather than with pure rationality, I don't think anybody really knows how people are going to respond in any given situation, and especially some of the situations that we can't really foresee, and some of the situations where a lot of the market participants might be kind of irrational, and a small number of the market participants might have some understanding of how they're irrational and be trying to exploit that. Because if you look at actual human systems, they all kind of look more like that second thing, right? They don't look exactly like a lot of rational people acting rationally. They look like some people with a bunch of varying goals, and some of them are sort of rational, and the people some of them have a grasp on the kind of irrationality that other market participants have, and they're able to exploit the irrationality of other market participants. And the terrifying thing about this is that you can kind of never really prove that the system works, right? You can never really be sure the crypto economic system works, because maybe it worked in the context of a rational actor model that you designed on paper. It's worked up till now in the social systems that it's come into contact with, but it may or may not work in future social situations.
You know, we had a talk yesterday by Eyal Winter, who is a game theory expert, and he was like, his topic was, decision making and emotions. Yeah, he used this concept of behavioral economics and constrained rationality. He didn't call them raging idiots. I think he used a more like academic term, but he was, I guess, thinking a bit about like people do not always behave with the rationality that you know, these crypto economics models sometimes assume. So I don't know, what is your take on that, maybe, Alex? When you design a system, you assume like perfect rationality. What happens with the behavioral aspects of humans?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting, and economics are kind of struggling with exactly these questions since centuries, how to kind of model our behavior and then how to build out general economics with that. And yeah, we have to go through the same process for designing good arbitration and oracle processes. And yeah, my current take is that at least currently for now, crypto really seems to be, because people need to mostly participate with a lot of stake in it. So I think overall, currently they are rationally driven, because they also have really a lot to lose, and that's not always the same case in the usual economies. So I think right now it's the right approach, but definitely I'm also sharing some of the concerns that Edmund has over there.
So I think what you have in the system is that they tend to be like to self-reject people who are not really rational. We can see in Kleros people who are tend not to be coherent to the draw, they lose their stake across time. So they automatically lose some chance of being grown, and they automatically lose their voting power. In prediction market, people who are bad at making prediction, they automatically lose capital. So the impact of their action in the system is lowered compared to people who are good at making prediction. That's also one partial explanation of why, like, if you assume that prediction market odds will be wrong, it may just be that those prediction markets are quite new, and we did not have enough time for having transfer of capital from irrational actors to well-rational actors, and that in a few years, once a lot of those markets will have settled, people who will have bet on the correct outcome most of the time will have multiplied their capital by a few, maybe 10x, something like that. And people who would have voted, like bet more or less randomly, may have lost maybe half of the capital, and they will have less impact on the system than people who have betted correctly. So I think what's important for the system is that as they are used and as they grow, they should give more and more weight to good actors of the system rather to bad actors of the systems.
I guess Hayek would say that the price mechanism would like settle any price, any information inconsistency in the markets in some way. You know, so
assuming they're resolved correctly.
Yeah. I'm seeing here William George, our research director. I don't know if you have any like take on this, if you're there, on the rationality assumption when building the models and behavioral economics and such.
Yeah, well, like you want to, one starts with models of rational markets because they're sort of easier to model, but like you certainly want to incorporate what we know about behavioral economics and human behavior, and the fact that there is a certain percentage of raging idiots in our world, and as you get more and more sophisticated models and more data from like how you've seen your users interact, like you can get maybe a little better sense based on sort of real world conditions. But it's true if you wind up in a black swan event where people are responding to a situation which is really different than the kind of situation you had before, it's hard to model that.
Yeah, good. So stay after this panel because William is going to give his talk so about the research challenges at Kleros. And I think that we're approaching the final. I would like to a bit like zoom out from this like discussion about oracles and talk a bit more about the future possibilities that we might get from prediction market, and in particular this like really intriguing governance system called Futarchy, right? Was introduced by Robin Hanson, I think in the 90s maybe, or not that early, but maybe Alex, you can tell us a bit like how Futarchies work and why they could be a good idea.
Yeah, the basic we call it /line is basically that people should vote for their values and belief, and then they should bet on their beliefs. So basically it is a governance tool where people should first in some way inject values, and with these values metrics are built up, how a system would, which metrics they would like to fulfill, which metrics they would like to perform well with. And then as a next step, one can set up prediction markets that give the system an indication whether a certain act is something good or not. So with that, you can really build full government systems. And just to make it maybe a little bit more accessible, one concrete example could be whether a certain investment should be made or not, whether this is kind of good for an organization or not. And then one could kind of look at the stock value of this organization once this investment has been done, or whether it has not been done. And depending on what the actual what the actual prediction markets believe, one can then make the decision which is more likely to increase the overall value of the company, and with that have this good steering mechanism. And it is kind of seen as a good governance mechanism, although of course it has also all its trickies and issues, because basically the people who are participating, they need to bet on their things. Like they cannot just vote, but they really need to put up their own money onto it and kind of bet in these prediction markets what would be better. And this then of course encourage them to better research, to kind of be more involved, and yeah, in the end really put the money where their mouth is.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. I think one area where prediction markets have actually really shown their worth, actually also in this kind of electoral cycle as well, is in getting people to reveal inside information. Right. So if you're trying to do, how should this company invest? Or the example Robin Hanson always gives is, should this company fire its CEO? Right. And it's quite hard potentially for a company to get the people who know the most about whether they should fire the CEO are probably the people who work at the company. But if the shareholders want to go and ask them, then they maybe have an incentive, unless they think the CEO is going to get fired, not to say bad things about the CEO, right? And so this information is often kind of locked inside an organization. And one thing that the markets were really good at this cycle, although they were all kinds of crazy about the Trump versus Biden odds, the VP contenders, they pretty much got, right. So they got they were on Kamala. There was a little bit of kind of volatility. There were a few times when they were wrong, but generally speaking, the markets worked out pretty early that Biden was going to pick Kamala Harris, and stuck with that till fairly late. So, and that was despite having a lot of problems like not enough liquidity and people not having access to the market. So they have this really good method of leaking this information that some participants have but don't necessarily want to give, and sharing that with everybody else. So that's a kind of an awesome property to have if you're trying to actually guide a decision, because all this information that people may not be incentivized to share, they are now incentivized to share. You could also use this in kind of sort of darker ways to kind of steal secrets from your competitor or something. If you want to work out what your competitor's going to do, you can make a prediction market on that, and then and maybe do a little bit of Facebook ads on their company's town, so that their employees all get those ads and participate in the market, and then you can find out what's going on, all these secrets they don't want to tell you. Sorry, I took us off of Futarchy a little bit, but
That's perfect.
but yeah, this property of just getting kind of secret information or insider information and putting it in the public domain is something that the prediction markets are definitely good at, and that's definitely useful in guiding the future.
Yeah, coming back on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think coming back on Futarchy, I think what is really interesting about Futarchy is that you split between the outcome that people want and about the action which are required to achieve this outcome. So in Futarchy, you vote on value. You vote on what you want to happen. So you could vote, for example, on do you want to get less inequality? Do you want to get more wealth in a specific organization? So you can vote on all this kind of stuff. But then if you vote in classical system, these tend to be a bit like it's the same vote as what you want to do and at how to achieve it. So if you elect someone, you have one package which is what are their value, what they want to do, and how do they plan to do it. While with Futarchy, you can really split those two. So you can say, I give this particular weight to the economy, I give this particular weight to wealth inequality, I give this particular weight to the climate not changing. And then you have markets which are created, and those markets can give you information on where you can allocate resource to have the most impact on your goal, on the value you want to be fulfilled. And people who can know how to allocate those value, they probably are less, you probably have less of them compared to people who want to vote on the value. You want the value which are voted to be aligning the general society, the general member of your organization. So for that, it's really important for everyone to vote, because you have a problem. Either you only have the elite voting, and they tend to be better than general population at achieving the outcomes they want, but the outcomes they want may not be the outcome that the general population want. But now we go the other way, where you have the general population which votes, which are obviously better at designing value, that are the values the general population want, but they may be worse than some elite at finding the way to achieve those sort of value. And you have this problem of what the elite vote and the general public vote. They both have this problem. And Futarchy, I think it's about splitting this process in two parts, which one process which is open to anyone, which is determining the value, and another process which is more an economic process, which is more a process for people who are specialized. And when I say specialized, it can also be by domain. Like, for example, for the coronavirus, that will be people in the healthcare industry, which will be specialized, not necessarily economists. But for some other part, that will be economists, which will bet on the prediction market and determine probabilities of particular outcome being fulfilled. And then that can determine what people should do. And I think that's where Futarchy can be really impactful.
Good. We have a question of the audience, and it's regarding all of these things we have been discussing, of how important it is that people have skin in the game when they make decisions and put their money where their mouth is. So, and this says the following from Paula Arroyo. One of the most important issues in arbitration is the impartiality and independence of the arbitrators. In recent years, various proposals and codes of good practice have been put forward. Among them is the Code of Good Practice of the Spanish Arbitration Club, which provides that the outcome of the dispute should not be to the benefit or detriment of the arbitrator. With the Kleros system, it is clear that the resolution of the dispute will have a direct impact on the benefit of the jurors. So what are the solutions you propose to ensure the independence of the jurors? I think Clément can answer this one.
So I think we are actually, well, you think it's a problem, actually it's even better than what the code will specify. So here you have a code which says that the outcome should not benefit juror or arbitrator. And I think this rule was made to avoid a conflict of interest between juror and the outcome. So for example, if it's, I don't know, if it's can we build this pipeline in this particular spot, probably you don't want to have juror which are living near this particular spot because they will have a negative impact if they vote on yes, the rule allow to do that. So you want to avoid this conflict of interest of jurors which will vote against the real result because the real result is affecting them in an adverse manner. With Kleros, you have the opposite. If jurors vote on what is the real result, they're going to be positively affected by voting on the real result. So it's even better. So you can have like no conflict of you can have conflict of interest, you can have no conflict of interest, and here you have alignment of interest. So I think Kleros is providing better guarantees on that because it's not just it should be zero, it should be positive to vote on actual result.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely the case if, for example, the juror has not staked much more in the prediction markets where it could actually favor him. I also don't think that this is a big issue because most likely, like you're drawing these arbitrators on random, so it's very, very unlikely that somebody's picked who has a bigger stake. But I think still the question is legit in a way that sometimes this might happen. And the only way how I think one can avoid it is if one really brings in the idea, the identity of the arbitrators, but this is a little bit against many of the other concepts introduced, and also the anonymity of the arbitrators actually protects them in many ways and makes them less bribable. So I think it's a very interesting topic, and there are no very easy solutions, I would say.
Good. Well,
Yeah,
we
we
have
have
run out of time. Just one last comment from you, Edmund, and then we close because we're running out of time. But
I was just going to say that bribery is a kind of a fascinating topic in crypto economics, where it's one of these things that, in theory, there are a lot of kind of bribery-related attack vectors, both to kind of the sort of Oracle systems and things that we build on top, and also to the platforms themselves, to the basic protocols. We haven't really seen very much exploited in the wild, and it'll be interesting to see. It might be that just the way humans work, they don't really work. And it might be just that people haven't really gone into them. And once we see one successful one, that'll open the floodgates and everything's going to break. It'll be fun to see.
Guys, thank you a lot for educating me in all of these fascinating use cases of prediction markets and also oracles, of course. This was a really interesting discussion. And well, we are going to do a small, short break now, and then we're back.